I have this career that's, going well and fine, but I also have this thing on the side where I'm starting to kind of make a name for myself. And so for a few years, it was kind of this balance where, okay, do I still push the career and see where that's going? Or do I take this side hustle where it kind of seems like I'm one of the, unique voices here and see where it can continue to grow, and slowly started to lean more towards that path.
Let's get it started.
Double O.
Free range, motherfucker. Yeah. Check 1 2 1 2. It's your boy Double O, and we are back with the Free Range Podcast, number 15. There is this emerging concept called the barbell economy, where the most opportunity happens at the bottom or all the way at the top of the spectrum. If you want to turn that sideways, on the left and the right. And the worst place to be is in the middle, not moving in the right direction. We can apply this concept now to the music industry in a variety of different ways. The biggest artists that we see, the superstars, we know that they're making all the money. But there's also been this huge growth in the independent space where the idea of 1,000 true fans has allowed for people, including Nipsey Hussle, people like Chance the Rapper, to really build this die-hard and at times smaller fan base. But then through hard work, some timing, scale to the other side of the barbell. This is also happening in music journalism to an extent right now. What you have is large publications with really famous writers that are allowed to write books, that are allowed to get the big stories and do all the deep dives. And then you have at the bottom a growing number of independent journalists, day jobbers / journalists, YouTubers, and a variety of people who've decided to pick up the pen or stand in front of the camera and have a conversation, critique music, artists, entertainment, and everything else in between. And it's been putting a squeeze on a lot of those journalists that are somewhere in the middle who've not made it to the New York Times or Rolling Stone yet and decided not to go the DIY route. And there's been an interesting conversation over the last couple of weeks about the need even for journalism. And I think that it affects those people the most, and they're often the most sensitive, the people who are stuck in the middle. Today on the podcast, I have Dan Runcie, who is the creator, founder, writer of Trapital. Trapital is a newsletter that explores the business side of hip-hop. He does a great job of deep diving into the business of moments that we just look as pop culture blips, whether that be Beyonce's Homecoming, where he does an excellent job of talking about her fan funnel in the streaming era, all the way to the impact of Dame Dash's ideologies and business acumen. I've been following him for a number of months. Sometimes I agree with him, sometimes I don't, but I love that he's taken the opportunity to really deep dive. I think that this is truly important kind of content and shows what can happen when the gatekeepers are eliminated and you have a way to go direct to consumer. So you're on the left side of the barbell. So we talk about everything from his upbringing, how Trapital came to be, and we dive a little bit into the industry as it stands, being an independent artist. We talk a lot actually about white rappers and how their success has created a bit of a barbell economy in the way that they can scale really quickly on one end and become huge superstars on the other end, and that squashes a lot of the other acts in between that may not have that privilege. We talk about whatever else is on the docket. So tune in, check it out. Make sure you follow Trapital. He just started a premium service that you can subscribe to at trapital.co. So make sure you check it out. Free Range with Dan Runcie. What's going on? What's going on, world? It is Double O. I'm back again with another free range podcast. And I'm here with somebody who I was put on to a couple months ago via his newsletter, Trapital. And ever since I've kind of tuned in, I've been excited to try to talk to you, and knowing that Justin Hunt and you were friends. It was an amazing thing for him to connect us. But welcome to the podcast, Dan Runcie.
Runcie, yes.
Okay, perfect. So I got put on to you because of your what you wrote about hip hop podcast in 2019. Surprisingly, and obviously we've seen kind of what's happened now over the last couple months with what Spotify has done with buying Anchor and acquiring Gimlet, how they are really invested in podcasts. But talk to me and talk to the audience about Trapital. So what is Trapital?
Well, first off, thanks for having me. Appreciate the work you've been doing. Checked out a few of the podcasts myself. And no, I'm glad that Justin had hooked us up. He's a good dude. And it's kind of funny how him and I had connected. But no, I'm glad that we're able to do this. Right. Trapital is a media company focused on hip hop business and strategy. And it actually started a year ago, but the idea was growing a little before that. And for years, I had wanted to elevate the discussion around hip hop. I feel like I've been a lifelong consumer and always enjoyed it. And 5-6 years ago, started getting into freelance writing myself. And throughout my career of business and education, I had learned so much about the business moves and strategies in a very, classical, traditional setting about all the other industries out there, right? Whether it's tech or, your Fortune 500 companies. But people weren't talking about hip hop in that same way. But those of us that, love culture have following the moves that Rockefeller and the moves that Bad Boy have been doing from the jump. And I wanted to have more of that discussion be looked at in the same way. And of course, we know that there's a lot of reasons why, hip hop moguls and entrepreneurs don't get the same credit that those do. But I felt that now more than ever, we are starting to be at this moment where there's an opportunity for more of this voice and exposure to get that same level of respect. Things that stuck out to me over the past few years that made that possible. When I was in business school 5-6 years ago, there was a case study that Harvard Business School put out on Beyonce, and it talked about her surprise album that she dropped in 2013. And it talked about all the decisions that Parkwood had made up to that point to pull that off, the success it had. And that had always stuck out to me to say, okay, there's an appetite for this. If Harvard's writing about this and it's making all the waves, people want to hear about this. And then after that, I started to see the evolution and growth of the Forbes Hip Hop Cash Kings list and how that just started to get more and more waves out through everywhere. And more and more people started talking about this. So then we kind of reached this point, the past few years where I felt like there was an appetite for this. And myself, I'd been doing freelance writing on the side as I was working and was writing a lot about the intersections of hip hop and business, but it was also always a bit more of a occasional piece here or there that I was trying to do. And even for the publications, I was writing for myself. It just wasn't as consistent. But then once I started to realize that there was a stronger appetite for this and I could do more and more of it, I started to make a home for it, make a name for it, and then send a few pilots off to a few friends and see where it kind of took off from there. And I've definitely been excited about the trajectory it's made over the past year and a few months, and excited to see where it goes from here.
Yeah, no, awesome. What were you doing before? Because you just recently took Trapital full time, correct?
Correct. Yep. Back in February.
Okay. And what were you doing prior to in terms of the 9 to 5?
Right. So I was working for an ed tech company at the time. So I had moved out to San Francisco 5 years ago. And for me, I had graduated from school. I graduated from business school, was looking at my career paths. I wanted to work in tech and I wanted to do something in education at the time. It was something that was very different to the work that I had done before, and I was able to get a role in strategic partnerships. So I enjoy that career path, but in a lot of ways, I felt like it was a fairly traditional path that a lot of people had. But around that same time, actually, when I was job searching for that job, I had started writing myself, and it was purely as a hobby. So I'd be working, doing the grind, 9 to 5, traveling all across the country for work. But then nights and weekends was focused on writing. What's this new idea I'm going to have? Where's this new piece? And it was a great balance for a while because it was a good way for me to have this creative outlet. But then the more and more I just started to do it, I just started my own page on Medium. Publications started to reach out and they were like, hey, this is dope. We want you to write for us. Like, can you write about this? Can you write about that?
And that happened without you basically without you even promoting it?
Exactly. There was no promotion. Literally, I set up, Dan Runcie has a page on Medium. I'm going to write about random stuff, whether it's, Kawhi Leonard and him still rocking cornrows in 2014, like it's the 90s, or talking about Blackish, because I think Blackish first came out at the time. I was talking about Rick Ross and some of the things he was doing. And then, within a few months, publications had started to reach out and they were like, hey, this is cool. Do you want to write for us? We'll pay you. So at that point, I was like, all right, well, what was a hobby? Let's make it a little side hustle and see where this grows, see where this goes from here. So, I just started doing that more and more. And then, like anything, you write for some of the smaller publications. It leads to writing for larger ones. And you have a little bit more, creative push, but then, some stronger feedback from editors. And they really established a true side hustle where I was like, okay, I have this career that's, going well and fine. But I also have this thing on the side where I'm starting to kind of make a name for myself. And people are starting to recognize the work that I'm doing. So for a few years, it was kind of this balance where, okay, do I still push the career and see where that's going? Or do I take this side hustle where it kind of seems like I'm one of the, unique voices here and see where it can continue to grow, and slowly started to lean more towards that path.
Was there any article in particular that you wrote that was kind of like the indicator that you should specify in terms of the hip hop business space? Because it seems like before that you were writing, you talked about some sports stuff, you talk about TV. What made you drill down into, what would become Trapital in terms of the voice and the content?
Right. It was a few things. So first, I had actually gotten the feedback from a few people that I had reached out to just, for a little bit of guidance of how to make it in this freelance space. And they were like, pick a lane. You're writing about a whole bunch of things. What is the thing that you are most passionate about, and being able to push that narrative and discussion throughout? And for me, I started to think about it. I was like, okay, no, of all those things, hip hop is the core of this, because even those other things, they were still largely, things of Black culture, right? Like Kawhi and his cornrows, that is an element of Black culture, or my opinions on the TV show Blackish. Like, they were all tied together, but I knew that the core of it was hip hop and where those things, stayed true to. So I wanted to make sure that push forward there. And then secondly, there was a piece that I'd written. I wrote a piece for Wired about DJ Khaled. And it was when Snap had their IPO a couple of years ago. And the piece was about how Snap and all these other people at Snap that got in early were making millions. But if we really want to pinpoint one person that I think the culture really looks at to say who made Snap pop, you got to give Khaled credit. He was on there and he was, jet skiing and talking about Major Key and all this other stuff. But you really got to give him credit. And of course, there's no structure within, how IPOs would, financially support power users, because that's obviously just not how they're positioned. But when you just think about the influence that the culture has on, at the time, one of the high IPOs that year, I was making a case for how that could potentially look and how his keep was relative to, the chief product officer or some of the other people there that were, monumental. So that was the piece that stuck out to me, be like, okay, I think I found something here. And if it's, writing for an outlet like Wired, this can grow and become something unique.
Okay, awesome. And then the name, just kind of just trying to put two things together.
Exactly. The name is interesting because I think naming things can be difficult, and a lot of people do have, regret about the names they pick. But for me, I knew that this was going to be about hip hop and business. And I wanted to be able to make people understand that, this isn't just, a voice of someone that's trying to sound like they understand hip hop. No, it's someone that truly gets this, but you're going to get, a deeper level of business aspects. So it's kind of this balance between, okay, do you pick an existing word? Do you pick something that's here? And then at some point, I forget when it came to me, I was just like, capital, how can we incorporate capital? And then of course, trap music, right? So then merging the two of those together. So I had that. And then I had like 3 other names. And I remember sending a short list to a few friends. And I was like, all right, out of the 3 of these names, which one of y'all do y'all like the most? And then they were all like, no, Trapital, go with that. Go trademark that right now before this conversation ends. And I was like, all right, bet, we'll do.
Awesome. And in talking about your connection with the culture, jumping back a little bit, what are your earliest hip hop memories? Like what brought you in to begin with?
There were a few things. For me, MTV and watching BET, those are probably the 2 earliest ones, I would say.
Where are you originally from? Sorry.
No, so I'm originally from Hartford, Connecticut.
Okay, Connecticut. Okay.
East Coast, yeah. So watching them and then seeing how the New York artists got put on, like whether it was, through the countdown shows or, just see the music videos put on, like those always like stuck out to me more than anything. And then growing up, my brother, I felt like always had an eye out for me, would like get me CDs of things that he thought that I would like. So whether that was, like LL Cool J's album that it came out, I think it was like 95, or the Space Jam soundtrack, like those things always like stuck out to me. And then, around that time, Bad Boy was starting to blow up. You had the whole Bad Boy Death Row thing. Like those were the pivotal moments that of my childhood that stick out to me. And ever since then, felt like it was always a part of my life. So, seeing the evolution of music videos through that time period, seeing the, just me also going to purchase these things and buying them for my friends, like all those discussions happened around that time frame and then just started to grow from there.
And did you ever see yourself wanting to be more than a fan? Was it one of those things where you were just like, the raps failed, the DJing failed, the producing sort of failed, I guess I have to just be a fan? Like, were you attempting to be a part of the culture in any way back then?
Back then, I wasn't. Okay. The closest I ever got was in high school. Friends and I would try to freestyle, and we would try to go record tracks and stuff. And I remember there was this. I remember when Welcome to Atlanta came out. Everyone, was talking about the remix where you had the, New York, St. Louis, and then you had Snoop Dogg that jumped on. And everyone was like, oh, we need to do one about Hartford. Let's make a Welcome to Hartford remix. So as funny as that sounds. So we're all thinking through like, oh yeah, halfway between New York and Boston and all, like it would have been the worst recorded thing that was ever made. But like, those are the type of things. And I remember even thinking about the little notepad that I had and like my friends had, looking through it. I'm like, no, none of that stuff ever would have. That would have.
It should never see the light of day.
It would have never seen the light of day. So yeah, that was funny. But I do have another like pivotal memory from that same time frame that I think was interesting, at least from like my own hip hop evolution. Like, because as I mentioned, I'm from Hartford, and for those that don't know Hartford, our music growing up leaned so heavily to New York radio. And to be honest, it's a bias that I don't even think I realized until I was much older. Like I literally growing up thought everybody listened to Mobb Deep. Like that's just how like central that world was. And it was like, no, like that isn't that way. And I remember going to visit my cousins that live in Orlando, Florida. And of course the music scene is like night and day down there. And I remember like we're going back and forth, like I'm like playing stuff for them and they had no idea what it was. And they started playing, what were they playing? They were playing Yin Yang Twins, but like before they blew up. So like it was around like when Whistle While You Twerk like first came out, and that introduced me to a new world. I was like, what is this? Like I had no idea what any of that was. So like the regionality of hip hop is also something that stuck out to me, and it stuck out to me in a way that I feel like I try to bring some of that same tone as well to the Trapital articles that I right about often, because I think like regionality is important, and you still see that even as ubiquitous as access is today, more than ever. But like that was also one of those like pivotal moments for me growing up.
I do feel like we've lost it a little bit. I mean, having toured for the last decade or so, I will say that it used to feel very different when you would show up in places and be like, oh, this is what's playing on the radio in New Orleans. That's vastly different than whatever I would hear in New York. But now, I could be in Boise, Idaho, and the openers for our show are going to be Drake clones. And then I could be in Denver and they'll also be Drake clones, and then be in Houston. So it's, outside of things like go-go music, sometimes I don't know how much regionality is even left internationally, as well, because now a song that comes out on Spotify or YouTube or SoundCloud, the time difference is the only thing that keeps that song from being heard by everybody at the same exact time. And I think it's created a very interesting world that I'm interested to see if there's going to be a new subgenre and or a new genre in general that can supplant it, just because of how quickly everything can get everywhere. It feels like it keeps those things that used to gestate, like the Yin Yang Twins, instead of them being international or rather national celebrities immediately, you have a region that buys into and loves it for a certain amount of time. And then when it's fully formed, then it explodes. And we just don't have that opportunity anymore. And I'm interested to see if that will affect how genres scale. From this point on.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. Like, it even makes me think about like Nipsey, for example. And I remember even within the past year, and like with stories I've written about him, I have a few friends that have either reached out or in group chats have been like, you know what, I'll be honest, I really wasn't checking for Nipsey until, Victory Lap blew up and he was like nominated for Grammy, or even, up until when he passed. And I started to think to myself, how much of that is regional as well? Because maybe, I've lived on the West Coast for the past 5 years, so I felt like I had a little bit of more of an ear to it. But it's not like it's any harder to necessarily check for Nipsey than it was, No,
and in fact, it's a lot easier. But I almost wonder if that is a larger. It's almost like, I guess the easiest thing is just everything has become extremely siloed and segmented. So I don't even know if it has to do with, let's say, something regionally as much as it might just have to do with, there are, for instance, we can look at the top charts right now. Let's look at the Billboard charts, and outside of Old Town Road, how many of those songs have you heard? Really, I didn't hear the new Shawn Mendes song that is number 2 right now. I've heard the Taylor Swift song maybe once. And so you start looking at what is big and because the monoculture doesn't exist anymore. I think it's really hard for things to scale. So I don't know I guess what I'm saying is I don't know how much of it is actual regionality, as much as it is just a straight, everybody's attention is being pulled in so many different ways that unless it's Kendrick, Drake, Cole, and whatever they hear on the radio, they probably, if you were to dig in on any of those guys, they probably wouldn't know a ton of it. They probably haven't listened to the last Fabulous mixtape either. Right.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I guess I didn't even think about it through that lens. Like, a song can be the number 2 or 3 song in the country and folks just aren't checking for it, right? But if you go back like 10, 15 years ago, if the song's the number 2 song in the country, like, my mom has heard of it. You know what I mean? And we're just not at that place anymore.
Yeah, and that it's interesting to even dig into a little bit of what you had spoken about regarding Nipsey. in your article, what I think is what I've always thought was interesting about, and I don't know how much your research uncovered about this. Two things. The first being, people thought that his move to charge $100 for an album or for a mixtape, and then eventually $1,000 was like a risky one. Mm-hmm. When in fact, when he talked about it a little further, he had already had 3+ years of customer data, and knew exactly how much each person had spent over the course of time. And so he knew that that his existing customer base could support that sort of purchase. And I always find it extremely interesting and would like to hear your thoughts on it. In the direct-to-consumer space that so many artists exist in right now, when you tell these stories, are you telling them to educate the person just starting out, or are you telling them to educate other artists who are in similar positions? It's a little circuitous. I apologize. I was trying to figure out.
Yeah, no, it's all good. In terms of me specifically in my pieces, I think they do both. And the feedback that I've gotten from people has confirmed that, whether it's people that are up and coming artists that have reached out to me through any channel, whether it's email or Instagram or Twitter, be like, hey, I'm up and coming. This literally is something that's top of mind for me right now. Thank you. Or it's the people that like work for teams as well of larger rappers that are like, oh, thank you for breaking down like what you thought about like what Nipsey's doing. This is helpful for me. And in terms of the earlier part of that question, I agree. I do think that it was a smart move. And in some ways, I'm still surprised that more people aren't trying to do at least some element of this, because essentially what he's doing is like, hey, I know that there is a subset of my customers that, really rock with what I'm doing. And whether I'm putting out, a 4-track EP or I'm putting out a long feature-length album, they want to be the first person or within the first group to get that before the general public does, and they're willing to pay for that. And if you can do that, and if you can, put something out there like he did, you sell out 1,000 copies, you just made $100,000, right? And there's nothing that should stop you from wanting to do that, because if you're just selling, your music for $10 a copy, or if you're just immediately putting it out on Spotify, on Apple Music, and all the streaming services, you're leaving money on the table. And every artist, regardless of how big you are, there is always going to be a subset of people that, rock with you more. And if you're in a business, you always want to try to say, okay, how can I maximize the willingness to pay for each person? That is ultimately how I'm going to make the most money. And you start to see more of this on the lower end, where a lot of artists will put their tickets on Groupon because they know that the person that goes on Ticketmaster at 10 a.m. when they go on sale, they'll pay full price. But there's also going to be the person that, maybe I won't pay unless I see the Groupon email come through, but they want to be able to get both of those, right? So you see that willingness to pay be maximized at the lower level, but how many people are really out here doing it at the highest level? You see it with some stuff like, okay, you can buy a VIP ticket where you pay $400 and you could, shake hands and take a picture with Kendrick, but you're not seeing it like from the album release part of it. And part of it's, with a bit of the, back and forth challenge with the streaming services and, how they've been looking at exclusives. But Nipsey did it outside of the streaming services. It was like, no, I got a store, come through to the store and, we can get it here. That's that whole vertical integration mindset that he's doing. And I think it was smart, and it was funny how it was looked at risky. I'm interested to see now that, his legacy is gone and we want that marathon to continue, how many people are going to try to do things like that.
Yeah. I mean, it is. The funny thing though is, and in reading a bunch of your articles, what I haven't seen yet is, where's the credit to Ryan Leslie, man?
Very true. Very true.
I think, and I know that before Nipsey did that what was it called? The name of the campaign was Pay to.
It was Proud to Pay.
Proud to Pay, exactly. Yeah. But I know that he had sat with Ryan and other people had sat with Ryan, and it's funny now that he is not necessarily getting the credit in really being the first person to say, "Hey, iTunes is not giving you your customer information. Twitter's not giving you your customer information. Spotify is not giving you your customer information. And you might sell less if you're not on these places, but you will also make more money ultimately." And, created his Superphone app. For some people that works. For some people it doesn't. For Nipsey, it worked. But how would you, right, if you were, let's say, an artist manager of somebody who has 0 fans, you just finished the first mixtape, how do you employ those ideals at ground level? Because sometimes I think that a lot of the business focused stuff in terms of the conversation helps people who've gotten past the initial certain initial threshold and scale.
Right.
But for the people who are literally like posting their first thing on SoundCloud, it is so far away from what you can actually do. So yeah, if you had first artist managing, trying to scale them up, can you employ any of those things?
Right. Yeah, it's a good question. And to be honest, I think it's tough to when you're first starting out, because I mean, by its design, you can't have super fans if you have 0 fans and you're just starting out. Yeah. So I do think that there does need to have to be a general approach where you're putting your music out, you're starting out with the people that know you, whether it's, your friends or your families or the connections you have, being smart about how you're pushing those. And then, having confidence that, the word can spread and, not being ashamed to be like, hey, can you help me spread this? Right. So you do those things. And then you also try to be smart about the platforms that you pick, because I'm sure that people that could read Trapital after a while can obviously get the thing that, okay, you can't necessarily rely solely on, all of the social media platforms for several reasons. But with that said, there's obviously still benefit to it. Like, we both have, social media accounts for our, media outlets. Every artist still does. Like Nipsey still had his, even though he talked about it. So you still want to be able to leverage the power that those do have to be able to have one-to-many, outreach. And then through those things, you do start to see, okay, who the fans are. Like, people will just start to reach out to you more often, and you'll start to realize that, okay, I can put out a general track that might be, mainstream and have mainstream interest, and I may catch a wide net, but I may have something that's, a little bit more niche. But then the people that are still reaching out to me, it's like, okay, noted. That person is like a super fan, or that person is there. How can I make note of that? And then knowing that there's some slight differences of, okay, how can you track all these things, whether it's, who's always trying to reach out of the DM, or who, like I think SoundCloud is probably a little bit better than the other tools in terms of being able to see, who actually rocks with you. Like Spotify, of course, I think is tougher than all of them to be able to at least have the interaction, but it has the reach that, a lot of them don't. So you do have to kind of start wide, but after doing that, for a certain amount of time, you can slowly start to see what happened. Like I look at Russ, for example, and like how he built his career up. And in a lot of ways, that has a lot of, at least the blueprint now for someone coming up through that, direct to consumer mindset. Because as we said earlier, Nipsey had been doing this for a while. I mean, his mixtapes go back, almost 15 years at this point. But like, Russ is someone that kind of came up in this SoundCloud era and, came to the point of, being able to sell out the Staples Center. Like that is a bit more relatable to someone starting off now in terms of how to do it. Putting something out once a week consistently, people know it's there. And then from there you can grow.
But you don't think with Russ, and it's just a general problem I have with him, so don't mind to push back a little bit.
A lot of that issues with Russ. I do too. But no, let's talk about
it. But in talking, let's say even specifically about him, we can say, oh yeah, just put, be consistent, put a song out every single week, and yeah, eventually something will work. But but we never really talk about how important the cultural fact that he is white, playing in a space, and scale is a lot easier, especially now, over the last 10 years, for a white rapper than it is for anybody else. And so he was, to a certain extent, granted a not that he hasn't worked, not that he hasn't busted his ass, but that like there was always that space that was going to be extremely beneficial to him. And that conversation is sometimes, a lot of times, left off the table when we talk about the benefits to, you know, what he, when we talk about really the larger benefits to watching what he did. You know, because, and even his argument that, you know, rappers should not be going into clubs, let's say, to do shows, getting 30 racks to, you know, do a 3-song performance, discounts the fact that the reason why they have to is because in those same places, hard ticket sale shows are hard to come by because the venue looks at them as a threatening act that might cause larger issues than they would him. So he can go and do a 200-person show somewhere and build a fan base to scale to be able to do Staples Center at, you know, 10,000, but an act from Atlanta that is from, you know, SWATs can't do the same thing because immediately their just presence alone is going to keep the promoters or the venue from allowing that to happen.
Right. No, I would agree with that. And I do think that's something that I actually haven't touched on with Russ in any of my articles, but it always comes up with him. And I think that really is like the underlying reason of why I think a lot of people don't rock with him, right? He has this holier than thou attitude about like what he thinks rappers should and shouldn't be doing. And, you know, some of the stuff I do think, you know, he actually is right about. But
no, some is extremely valid. It's
where are you coming from? Like where you're saying it. And then do you realize that, you know, you didn't necessarily have to worry about some of those things. So no, I agree with that. And in a lot of ways it's frustrating. And like, I wish that, you know, we had like other examples we can point to that kind of follow that same blueprint. And I think we do, like, to some extent, but the fact that, you know, I guess he hasn't necessarily acknowledged the privilege that kind of comes with that, the same way that, you know, some other white rappers haven't is part of the challenge.
Who would you say has that we can even point to then as another example?
I think that, you know, before he passed, XXXTentacion did. I think that he, you know, did a pretty good job of being able to come up through the SoundCloud path.
Yeah. With his whole other sets of cultural problems.
It's like, I know I'm bringing up problematic people, and that's probably part of the challenge. But like, I do think he did. Like, I mean, he definitely had like, you know, a path on the rise, but it was also like, you know, he did a lot of, you know, shit as well. That was like, all right, can't rock with this guy.
Yeah, I think, you know, that is always the larger. You know, the interesting thing to me always about musicians and business in general, but especially hip hop, and definitely now to a certain extent R&B, since they very much are mixing it up, is you cannot disconnect the business moves from a lot of the cultural stuff around it, because it's built into the ethos of it all, you know, keeping it real, or why people decide to fuck with certain artists really is always built to whatever idea that they have of that person's cultural cachet. So I do, you know, whenever I think about the business side of a lot of things that are successful, I always have to just look back and say, okay, but what cultural components are at play here? You know, watching someone like XXXTentacion, and essentially you're looking at a live train wreck happening, and you could say that the scale with which he was doing so was done because people love to see the train wreck. They love to see the speeding train crash.
Yeah.
And it almost couldn't end any other way because that wouldn't be what the people essentially wanted.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, in terms of like the cultural aspects that tie into it, like one of the pieces that I actually have on the back burner that I'm going to write about soon is, measuring the privilege that, white rappers have and the success that that's had. And Russ is one example, but I think the cornerstone of the piece is actually going to be about Post Malone and how he's just been able to rise this last year to have one of the biggest, I guess, quote unquote, hip hop records. I guess if it's considered a hip hop record, how he's able to, be, collaborating with all the big artists and so many of his own like statements that have been problematic as well. Like how that, affords you privilege, but like, what does that, take as a cost of how the people that really feel like they like, care about the culture, like, does that like matter? Does it like make a difference? Like, and I'm obviously still kind of wrapping my head around it to be able to talk about it, but like, that's a very top of mind thing. And I think it's like germane to this conversation.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I consider Post Malone the first non-hip hop artist of like, the scale. Yeah. Because he's grown up never connected to the culture, and he'll say it. We have video evidence of it. Obviously, his early, folk records and whatever else he was working on.
Yeah.
Yeah. At some point, he connects the dots with it because it's much like Miley Cyrus, I guess, it's the cool thing to be a part of because it's what his peer group is doing.
Right.
But then in that, he all of a sudden he connects the dots and finds a way for his music to scale playing in this space. But I think that he has absolutely no connection to it and no need for there to be a connection to it, but can benefit wholly from just sonically making music that sounds like it.
Right.
So it's interesting because I don't even consider him a hip hop artist. Whereas even someone like Russ, I still think he wants people to say he's dope. Like as a rapper and as a like he still is looking to the culture for certain things. Someone even like G-Eazy, which is much pop success as he has. When Jeezy's not in front of the cameras, when Jeezy is just kicking it, you see him with E40. You see, like he is of a Bay Area culture that you just kind of the educated person can see it through and through, even though it may not feel like it necessarily comes across in the music. So I look forward to that because I do think it's a very interesting conversation because I've watched it happen over the last, going back to artists like Sammy Adams. Like I don't even know if you remember that era.
Oh yeah, didn't he? He's a guy from Boston, right?
Yeah, exactly. But watching where essentially you have white rappers starting to scale like indie bands, and kind of being afforded again that I don't think a lot of people really understand how much just being considered a non-threatening artist plays into even being able to do shows. Right. Like the difference between Migos wanting to go do, let's say SOBs, for example, or any, venue in New York, Irving Plaza, versus if Logic wants to do it, the promoters and the people that work there don't even see Logic as a rapper in that way. So they don't have a problem having that show. And to a certain extent, especially if it's all ages, the demographic of the fan is also going to be extremely different. They're not going to be out there, to be 13-year-old kids getting dropped off by their mom.
Right.
But yeah, I look forward to seeing kind of how that plays out in terms of your article, because it is a very interesting. It feels like there's different pressure happening from both ends. From the top end, where you have, I was at Soundset last year, and Logic gets billing over Migos because he brings in more fans, more hard ticket fans to an event than Migos does. But you can make the argument that obviously Migos is a bigger,
right,
quote unquote band, or a bigger group. And so you have these interesting happens where Logic, and then, we talk about Russ or G-Eazy, where they can do Staples Center, and they're essentially operating at the scale of a Nicki Minaj. But if you were to ask any general person, like, oh yeah, Logic's in town versus Nicki Minaj is in town, you would assume that the Nicki Minaj show would sell out and be
right,
the bigger sort of. So you have that happening at the top, and at the bottom, you have this ability to scale in these smaller venues because they're willing to take a chance with those acts. And so it's this weird leapfrog thing that's happening where you can then go from the 250, 500 person venue to now you're doing a 2,500, 5,000 person venue. But a lot of the other artists that we might consider huge superstars that are not white are somewhere squashed in between.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. And I look a lot at album sales as well, like especially first week is kind of a proxy for how big people are. But at least since streaming has blown up, they've started to separate how many of those album sales are like pure albums, like people actually, spending the money versus streaming. And your Migos Logic comparison actually highlights that, because I remember I wrote a piece last fall about why no one was checking for the Migos solo albums. And I think it's for a number of reasons. But when you looked at the album sales, the pure albums that they sold was a pretty small fraction of the total music. So it kind of tells you a few things, right? They're very popular from like an average like rap perspective. And I think the team at QC does a good job of making sure, okay, we got music out there, everybody stream it, it's ubiquitous, get it out there. But do the Migos like have that like core fan base that is like there at these places? And obviously I think it's for a lot of these reasons we talked about, as opposed to someone like Logic, right? Because, the Migos could very well outsell Logic, but I guarantee that Logic has more pure album sales than the Migos probably do. And it's for the same type of reason. And that kind of difference is, just one way to quantify it, but it kind of, permeates with everything of like, like whether it's merchandise being comped or, concert venues, the sellouts, all those type of things.
Yeah, I think we're running into this weird space, and we can move on from jump from this after, where we're almost back to without anybody knowing it. Sometimes it feels like we're back to this really early 1950s, early 60s sort of version of the music industry where, the Temptations could do a cover of a song and it be successful in a space, but then the Carpenters do a cover of the same exact song and it is, hugely successful, but it's the same exact song. The difference obviously being in perception and who they are. Right. But I actually wanted to dig in a little bit in terms of how you approached a year ago. Trapital is your indie rapper, right? It is so what did you do day one to start kind of like building the audience and getting people through to your funnel now, which is launching the website and having a subscription-based service? Was that always the goal, or were you just trying to, that just made sense as it stands right now?
So the subscription website was always the goal with this. And like when I started to think about the value of the content and the ability to be able to, not just make a living for myself, but, have something sustainable, I knew that, even though I knew that this topic would be big to a lot of people, it was still a relatively niche like space, right? And when I looked at the media landscape, I really felt like it was a barbell. And I know a lot of people have talked and written about this, but you can kind of be successful at two ends. You're either a large player like a BuzzFeed or a HuffPost, where you're putting out hundreds, if not thousands of articles a day, and you're trying to sell ads. And just the way that, the ad model works right now in media, you need to have a lot to make it work. So if you're a niche player, or if you're kind of stuck in the middle trying to sell ads, it's going to be very tough to maintain. So that's why, a lot of these companies have either, had to do layoffs or shut down, specifically, even the ones that started as like, digital media businesses. On the other end of the barbell, you could be a small niche player with either, one or a few employees focused on a particular topic or a niche, but then that it's not going to appeal to everyone. So that model may not necessarily make the most sense, but if you can kind of, scratch, take the cream of the crop that are most willing to support that content in the future. It's kind of so much of that Nipsey thing we're talking about before, and have those people be the ones that support you, knowing that you can keep your costs relatively low. You can do relatively well for yourself. And, I was thinking about the model with that. I said, okay, do I feel like there are, a few thousand people? Like, I know Trapital has had the reach where, it does now. So I'm grateful for that. But are there enough people out there that really care about this, from like, this helps me with my job, or I like your writing, or I just want to support this, I can make a living? And I said, okay, no, I'm willing to take a bet on that and see where it goes. So that was the thought, like with the business model itself and how I decided to go about the subscriptions. But I'd say additionally, in terms of my own growth with that, I knew that I wanted to start with an email list. It kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier, that it can be tough to rely on the social networks and, for all of their algorithms and not being able to have that direct relationship. So I essentially put out my own trailer that was like, hey, starting a newsletter on hip hop business. I'm digging into the why and the how, and we're going to tell these stories because I think we can learn just as much from Jay-Z and Rihanna as we can from Mark Zuckerberg and Meg Whitman, period. Sign up here, link. Sent that out through all my listservs, all my, social media groups, everyone. And then things started to people just started to kind of subscribe through there. And I was like, okay, even though people that signed up initially kind of surprised me just with the sheer number, that's when I was like, okay, that was the trailer, but we're on to something here. So I had started it out later in, it was the beginning of March when I started, did it bi-weekly, putting a few pieces out there. And like anything, I kind of had my own thoughts about where this was going to go. But then I started to shift after seeing the responses for a few pieces. And one of the ones early, there were two pieces I did early that stuck out and kind of set the direction. One of them was about Damon Dash and Rockefeller and how the Hard Knock Life tour, which was now 20 years ago, had, I think, paved the way for a lot of modern hip hop concerts because no one just wanted to have a hardcore rap billing. You always had to be paired with R&B or paired with something else. So I talked about that. And that story had made its way around and a lot of people were interested in that. And I was like, okay, there's something here. And then the next week I wrote a piece about J. Cole and how I felt like that Dollar and a Dream tour that he started, 6 years ago, and just the mindset of that and his own journey of how he tried to do the mainstream thing with his first debut album, felt like he got away from his core, charged people $1, found the people that were willing to wait in the pouring rain for him. And even the people that didn't go, how that tour built on his legacy and what it means. J. Cole has his stands and, as annoying as they can be online sometimes, there's a value in that. And I wrote about that. And that piece blew up. And that's when I said, okay, we're 2 months in, I'm having two of these pieces that are here. Let's shift the direction a bit to talk about those kind of stories as opposed to just apparel and stuff. And then let's see where that goes. So that was kind of the growth. And like anything, you start to share. And then through email, you can kind of build stronger connections with people more than I ever had done as a freelance writer for Wired or anything for Complex or any other pieces. And then things just started to kind of snowball from there. It went past the friends of friends and it went to, people at record labels and people that, work for rappers like artists themselves and people starting to reach out. I was like, okay, we're on to something. So let's keep doing this, write more frequently and see what happens.
You are one of the first people, and it might just be because I'm late to the game, but you're one of the first people that when I started digging down the rabbit hole after reading the first, one about the hip hop podcast conversation, that I saw that I felt was like really effective on LinkedIn. Was that a strong part of your, in the marketing of the newsletter?
I think it helped a lot. And that was one of those that came after. That wasn't necessarily, in my initial plan. Because LinkedIn had a pilot series that they had started to do for what they had called series, but it was essentially newsletters. And I was like, okay, I'm already using a service to send through email, but LinkedIn is a business platform, and there could be benefits of being a beta tester for them. And I started to make a few connections there with some of the leadership with LinkedIn's editing team, and was able to send that out and, benefit from some of the reach that I was able to get through there. And we all know, although LinkedIn isn't as, algorithmically, tied as Instagram and Twitter are, they still are there. But I think it's a little bit easier to kind of shine above the, a lot of the stuff that people just kind of share on LinkedIn. So I do think that helped me in terms of just getting the word out there. It's just another channel to essentially window my own content onto LinkedIn. And in many ways, I knew it was kind of twofold, right? Because I know I, still wanted the core audience to be on the email listserv because I didn't want to be relying on LinkedIn or whoever's algorithm. But it opened me up to new folks as well that didn't learn about me. And it's just kind of easier for people to see things. It's one of the few platforms where if you like something, people can see it. And there's just a little bit more of an added credibility and way to stand out because, Double XL or, Complex aren't using LinkedIn as much. And even the Forbes Cash Kings list doesn't really make its way on LinkedIn as much. So I knew I could kind of stand out in this network that everyone was on anyway.
Yeah. And you are the first person to put me onto Substack as well. What made you decide to use them, and, what was their benefit in obviously utilizing that service?
So Substack made things very easy for someone like me to do what I was doing at quote unquote that smaller side of the barbell. They had seen what the success that this one writer named Ben Thompson, who writes this tech publication called Stratechery, where he talks about the business models of tech. And that guy was able to, build a platform where he's charging people $10 a month to write about this particular topic. And it's a freemium service. So those guys were like, okay, we want to empower more writers to be able to do that. Let's create the stack of having a website to host your blog post, integrating an email service for you to send your newsletters out, and combining the payment system as well. So it was really supposed to be it is an all-in-one tool for people to be able to, send out, their content. And I think for me, it made things pretty easy in the early days because I don't have a coding background. I really didn't, understand or ever built a WordPress website or anything like that at the time. So it helped me focus purely on content creation in the early days, but still leveraging the ease of use of being able to collect email addresses and being able to have that be the main tool. So that was pretty beneficial for me, in the first year of growing Trapital. And I think one of the good things too is that it's free to start out if you're just having a free newsletter. So I didn't necessarily have to pay anything in order to grow that influence. Although in last month, knowing that I was taking Trapital to, my own, paid subscription service and being able to charge additional for that, I actually made the decision to move the content that I have from that off of Substack and then start my own set home and a website there to do that. And for me, it was strategic for a few reasons. Although Substack had the ease of use, and if I had a paid subscription service on their website, I would have been charged a fee for it as well. But I knew that being able to just own the each element of my website and properties just made things a little bit more flexible for me for in the future, because I do believe obviously in the potential and the business model what Trapital has, but I may want to take this in another direction as well. Like I want to be able to maintain that flexibility. And I think if I was too tied to a platform that was solely focused on, an independent solo newsletter creator that's trying to build something out, it may have been harder for me to switch, sooner rather than later. So, I mean, it was good, especially from a time perspective. I just started full time on this, 3 months ago. So this was no longer just a hobby. Like I'm putting, my own, everything into it. So of course I lost a little bit of that flexibility, or not that flexibility, the ease of use in being able to build. But I also realized that Trapital in many ways kind of grew beyond what I thought it did. And there's a brand identity that I think readers and a lot of folks feel with that when they, see Dan Runcie come in the inbox and they see something. It's not just, oh, I want to hear about this topic. I want to hear what he has to say about this particular topic because of the way that he thinks about things and the way that, the way that he writes it. And I might agree, I might disagree, but I at least respect kind of where the opinion's coming from. And it leads to that thoughtful place, because as you probably, and others have seen, I'm not always going to, take the side of the artist or just take whoever. Like I definitely try to have that biased tone or that unbiased tone. And if someone, needs to, be either called out, or if there's a better way to do things, I want to be able to maintain that. So yeah, I think me building and taking the service off of a platform like Substack, was more effort for me. But like anything, I think that it'll be more worthwhile in the long term in terms of me being able to lean into the brand building and the larger opportunities of what Trapital could become.
Awesome. And then when that 3 months ago, how did you know that you could leave the day job? What was it like? Were there just like, okay, I've hit this number. I know if I only get 10% of these people to pay, I'm good? Or was it more of a like, no, I need to just focus on this thing now because going to the day job is no longer as fulfilling as it was?
Yeah, I think it's probably a mix of both of those things, honestly. I mean, like things were going fine at the day job, but I knew when I started it that this was going to be the move eventually. And I also knew that I wanted the money to be right as well, because I live in San Francisco. It's expensive as anything to live here. And I wanted to make sure that that bonus check came through and I had enough money in my bank account to make this happen. So that was the biggest thing. So that bonus check came, literally middle of January. That same day, had the conversation, was like, hey,
I'm out.
So, I mean, no one was too surprised. They knew that they like a lot of them follow, and I'm grateful for their own support as well with Trapital, but they kind of knew where this was going. And as I kind of reflect on the time, I probably would have left, a little bit sooner, but wanted the money to come in right. And I just knew that even though I wasn't quite where, like I was like, not everything was like perfect where it's like, okay, you wait for things to be this launched. It kind of had to be a little bit of like an intuition as well. Like if I waited until there was this like perfect comfort period of like, okay, kind of like you had suggested, like, you have X percent of people and this many people convert, you'll be good. Like I knew that could have gotten there, but there's also the value of the momentum that I was able to build as well. And sometimes if you wait too long with that, it can be hard to capture that. No different than, me turning the freemium model on of Trapital and having additional content during the week for people that, are willing to pay for that. If I waited too long after, leaving the full-time job and not having something lined up, it's kind of like, okay, like, what did you quit for? You're still putting out the same amount of content. Like, what have you been working on? And I couldn't say just enough to be like, yeah, but you don't understand. I'm actually getting sleep now. You know what I mean? Like I was up till 2 and 3 in the morning, right? And going to work at 9. Like now I, have a normal person schedule to an extent, but it's like, no, I knew that people wanted more and I wanted to be able to push myself. So yeah, I'm definitely excited about that.
And how has the feedback been regarding the the subscription service? Has there been pushback in terms of people being like, oh, now you're trying to charge for this thing? Or has it just been, do you think, I have this weird feeling now that I feel like because I watched a few podcasts go now to a subscription-based model, that there are like, if someone views you as like, oh, this is, a one-man operating sort of thing, and I enjoy this, so I should be okay with funding it, versus, let's say, if you become some big conglomerate and then they're like, they don't need the money. Like how has the reaction been, from your existing kind of like fan base and readers to the fact that they have to possibly pay now for more content?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny. I was expecting all of that. I thought that there were going to be responses like, oh, now you want to come charge you money. Oh, now you want this, right? But surprisingly, I've gotten very little of that. I definitely got, a pretty strong response on the first couple of days of people reaching out, either saying, hey, like, proud of you for doing this or proud of you for doing that. Because in the announcement that I did, I tried to add, plenty of context and rationale for why I'm doing this, right? In many ways, of course, it helps support me, but it also ties in with the overall goal of what we all want from this, and trying to make it seem like, this is even a little bit bigger than me. Like, we're in this because we want to elevate this content and this discussion. And part of that is also placing a dollar value on it when we think it is worthy of that dollar value. People won't hesitate to think about, the Wall Street Journal charging, $40 a month, or the information.
I do, by the way.
I do too. I actually haven't paid that much either, but I respect the friends that do, or even the people at tech that'll pay, $40 a month for the information. Granted, these are large teams that, are putting out enough content to justify, but then you also have the people that have been doing essentially what I'm trying to do with Trapital in other niches that are, charging, $100 a year or more for their content. So I tried to position it that way. And at least I felt like the response was, well taken. And I know, like, it's an adoption like anything. Like, I'm going to, at least early on, get the people that are like, yes, I am bought into this. This is the first time you're asking for something. Yes, I will support. But then you have the people that are like, okay, I agree with like what he's necessarily saying, but let's see what this content's talking about, right? Like, let's see like what he is talking about and whether that's necessarily like, relevant for me, and then kind of going from there. And then knowing that I'm also growing as well. Like, my readership continues to grow, even with, the free email list that I have. So much in the same way that I write about these artists and think about the business models that they take, it can be, helpful as well, because it also relates to some of the things that I think about myself, and that I'm sure you probably think about as yourself too, with your podcast, and just how we are trying to build our brands and how we're trying to grow and build the right audience and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely in an, for me, the big thing, my whole thesis was that being in the music industry for however many years is much like an MBA program, in that you're learning every aspect of business, especially in the most difficult, weird, craziest way, whether it comes to, negotiating properly in terms of contracts, whether just to be, building strategic partnerships, all of these sorts of things, really knowing your customer. And so, it was uncovering that in a similar way, and being able to kind of make it something that other people can hopefully benefit from. And so in going, and this is just a random question, but in going now to subscription, how does that change your content's ability to propagate itself, I guess? Let's say, because I see you, obviously, you pop up a lot in a lot of other, whether it be like Redef or Beats and Bytes with Jesse Kirschbaum, they'll use your articles in their recap emails and things like that. Is it just going to be one of those things where when I go to click on that article now, I have to sign up if I'm not already signed up, or?
Right. Yeah. And I think that's why the freemium model that I've had will still be good and will still work, because those articles, the ones that still get shared the most, I'm still going to be putting out that one, free deep dive article a week that goes deep on one subject and really tries to, take a stance and, explain why. So those articles, I think, will be shared and will continue to get shared. And at least if it's my preference, those are the ones that will make the redefs and, all of the other sites that I've been fortunate that have shared my content. The additional content, it takes a little bit of a different form in that these are quicker hits about the more timely things that are happening. So in many ways, the way that I've thought about my own funnel is that those deep dive articles, I spend a lot of time on them trying to make sure that they, are sound and, they add value. But I know that they also are credibility building as well, so they can help build that audience. So someone can read one of those, oh, wow, this is interesting. Now I'm interested to subscribe to this newsletter. And then it's essentially building my own funnel, right? Because I think it makes more sense for me to have that and then the quicker updates, because at that point, if you're kind of bought into the voice and you want to more hear what I'm saying, you're going to be more interested to hear, okay, what do I think about, Woodstock 50 and it being, a nightmare right now? Or what do I think about the rise of Lizzo or, Megan Thee Stallion or whoever it is? Like, you're going to be interested to hear that. You would be more likely to pay for that content. So it's less likely that would be shared. But I also have a discussion forum as well, where the people that are, members, that's kind of the area where we can kind of discuss and then build the community from that perspective. So I still think that, it definitely helps my marketing efforts to still keep this as a freemium website and not have everything behind the paywall, because that ultimately continues to help me grow and then serve those that are most interested in hearing, everything that they think I have to say.
Awesome. In with all that said, what would you like to see business-wise that you feel like is either not happening or is being left on the table in hip-hop right now, from not the megastars, not the Beyoncé's, Rihanna's, Jay-Z's of the world, but from those people in the middle on their way up?
Yeah, that's a good question. If I'm trying to think of someone hypothetically that's a good person to use as a case study for this. Let's see. I'm trying to think who's a good person that's on the rise. Okay, well, no one's coming to mind directly, but
let's do Megan. I mean, she's a little early. Maybe
okay, yeah, she's early. So if I'm her, I think that I'd be looking at this next week pretty closely, because I just put this album out, but I also want to take it with a grain of salt, right? I can't necessarily, maybe I can't compete with Old Town Road and, all the dominance it still has, but there's clearly a subset of, whether it's a mix of Black Twitter or, Instagram or whoever that are riding with me right now. How can me and my teams be able to use data to be able to have a better idea of who these people are, right? So can I work out a deal with, I should forget who she signed to, but can I work out a deal?
She signed with 300.
Oh yeah, that's right.
300 Atlantic,
Yeah. So can 300 work out a deal with Spotify or Apple Music where I can get data to see, okay, where was I most trending and popular, right? I know I have Houston on lock, but where else is that, right? I don't want to wait for the New York Times to put out their regionality reports. I want that. And then how could I then use that information? So when I, not just for this coming tour, but for the next thing or little pop-up things, how could I be able to do that and build that base? Because I think the pop-up shops selling merch, it really isn't about the merchandise as much as is, okay, let me put out a product that I know that people want to support. What can they pay? And then based on, the interest of that, then I can be even a little bit more strategic with, the next tour that I have. And even the little things, whether it's, okay, do I do 2 nights in this region at a small venue? Do I just pick this because it's a larger region and it's LA? All those little things hopefully can become, a little bit more specific. And then at that point, let's say she has a few more reps. She's, pushed Fever as far as, she can with its legs. Then if I'm looking at the second stage, then maybe we could start to, look at who are some of the cream of the crop of those people that are like, those day one fans that were with Megan, before this album dropped and, with the mixtapes and stuff. So I think that's eventually how, you can get there. And I think it takes some time for sure. Yeah. But those are the steps. That's at least how I would be thinking. Like, how can I try to get data and make it as, valuable as possible?
And then from the flip side, do you think, because we came up in a similar time when the music business has always been important, but the business of hip hop was not necessarily at the forefront of the artist's mind. It was about making the dopest thing possible. Mm-hmm. Do you think that now, because all we see are the Forbes Cash Kings list, all we see are Beyonce just did this deal for $60 million with Netflix or whatever it is. All we see are these big money deals, exclusivity deals, Fenty Beauty, that every artist going into all of this now is essentially just trying to make themselves a brand to be able to be sold off versus actually making good music. Like, is the business of hip hop essentially good for hip hop as a culture and as a, as a musical art form in general?
Right. Yeah. It's like the influencer mentality, right? And it's like one of the criticisms that whether it's the little pumps or whoever, like, are you really here because you care about this? Or are you, just trying to make a name so that you can, sell off your likeness or whatever to go sell some Gucci belts or whatever it is. Right. Like, I think eventually, I feel like every label and every team is at least thinking about this. And I think that in a lot of ways, the labels know that it could ultimately indirectly help them, because even though they may not have their money tied to whatever, business the artist makes off of, the success of them, it still indirectly can help them just for people wanting to check for it. But yeah, it's like, is music just is music going to become a means to an end of becoming this brand, or is it going to still be the means for people? And I think that it is going to differ based on the artist. And I still do, I guess, even as a core fan, still want there to be artists that are no, my job, my end is the music. This is ultimately what I want and everything to circle around. And I'm still going to, do the endorsement deals or do this thing or do that thing. But at its core, I'm still going to want to be the artist. I still think that will be there, because even if you look at someone like Rihanna, who I know I've written about a few times, she doesn't strike me as someone that's truly done with music. Yeah. Who knows? It may be a while until we get the next album, but she doesn't strike me as someone that's done with this. And I'd probably say the same about Kanye as well. Even though no one is really checking for these albums, right now, I don't think that, well, I guess to be clear, his album specifically, his Ye one, I think, Pusha T's album with Daytona was good, but his work specifically, I still think that even if Yeezy continues to take off and do well, he's still going to be an artist at the core and will still want to make music. So I still feel like that's where things will lean toward.
Yeah, it's because what I always try to tell people is, for me, and you've written an article about it, even talking about someone like Drake, right? In talking about his business moves, what I think is also forgotten is the fact that before we really know Drake business moves, we were getting an album full of amazing records every single year for almost 7 years. Mm-hmm. If you think about, the first 4 albums in his career, you don't really have much else to talk about other than Drake in his music and the studio, right? You don't have a sneaker deal. You didn't have a liquor conversation. You had this early Sprite conversation. But other than that, you really simply have Drake is in the studio every day making great music, mm-hmm. to make the best music, to then be at the top of the charts every single year for a certain amount of time.
Right.
And, sometimes I think that's sometimes lost in the story. It's just like, oh yeah, but he made sure the music was as good as it could be to be as ubiquitous as possible, so that all these other things are then afforded, a couple years down the line.
Yeah.
But so you believe that, you just think that we're in this weird position now as a country. And I guess this is kind of why I always look at hip hop as a microcosm of of the US, because it is so tightly woven into its fabrics of the American dream and success and capitalism and all of that. In that, do we think it's sometimes a little dangerous to the culture at large to be so heavily invested in promoting its capitalist ideologies? Because then it ends up destroying
the culture,
even the fans themselves. The culture and the fans. You know?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I mean, even like, when I think about Drake, I mean, one of the pieces I done last year is how I really feel like he switched. He eventually switched it. And I think I agree with everything you were saying in terms of what he was doing earlier on, when music was the core, everything went into that, right? But then I think when streaming really blew up and he started to pivot his strategy more to that, it seemed like, okay, almost what is the minimum viable product I can put out that is going to do well? And it's okay, let me put this, 29 track album, however many tracks was on Scorpion out there. I know that most of these tracks are mid, but some of them are going to be enough to get radio play, and let me worry about all this other stuff. And as him being the person that everyone in the culture leans towards, I do think there is definitely some frustration with that. I even look at DJ Khaled's album, The Father of Assad thing that he put out. And I think I talk about this with my friends all the time. Khaled, from my perspective, him and his compilations were at their best, probably 10, even 12 years ago, because artists were incentivized to bring their best on a Khaled record. This was a posse cut. You wanted to see who could win, who was going to get the best bars. And there's just not the same type of, what's the word I'm looking for? There's just not the same type of incentive to be able to bring your best. If anything, you want to save your best for the songs on your own album. But Khaled's asking, all right, let me just give these, just good enough songs at best to see where it goes. And that's how we kind of end up with the albums he has. Because even if he tries to do his best with, even if he tries to do his best with bringing the artists together and producing and building these sounds, it's just not there. So some of that's kind of frustrating. But
do you think that is because of the business side of things, where everybody is going, they're setting up an album and they're like, oh, this is going to be successful because it's got a Samsung tie-in, it's got this tie-in, it's got this, so whatever, I've made my money? Or do you actually think that that's something that's happening because the fans are accepting mediocrity or averageness because they've bought into the person as a whole, regardless of just the music? In other words, the conversation doesn't stop when the album stops. The conversation will continue on Instagram later, will continue on Snapchat later, will continue on Twitter tomorrow. So they're okay with accepting average quality because they might be there for, Cardi B cursing out somebody on Instagram later, rather than whether the thing they used to covet was the only conversation that I'm about to have with this artist is in this CD. Do you think it's coming from one or the other?
Yeah, I think that's a factor. I mean, because if you think about, let's take Cardi B. I mean, Invasion of Privacy had plenty of hits, but I think if you're asking, real fans, okay, of all the albums that won Best Rap Album or were nominated, do you think that was the answer? You would get a lot of different answers based on the people that you end up asking. And in some ways, I think it kind of leads to what you're saying. she wanted to save her best or she would have wanted to save her best in the past because that was the only time she had. But she knows that she can say something viral about her take on, taxes or her hating Bird Box or whatever it is, and it get, millions of shares. So it probably puts less pressure on it. And I think that dynamic gets intensified when you look at these compilation albums, because it's like people are just excited to see me on this track. People don't really need me to bring my best on this track, right? And I think, sometimes you'll see people that are just kind of old school and will do it. Like I think about like Jay-Z's verse on What's Free on Meek Mill. Like he definitely like brought it there and wanted to bring his best on, or relative his best that he, had done recently there. So he'll do it. But Jay-Z, he's almost 50. He's part of that older regard, right? Older guard. Like there's less incentive for people. So I agree with that. There's less incentive now for people to bring their best when there's other channels to do so. And that is even less important on someone else's album.
Yeah. Like I look at Nicki Minaj's biggest hit of last year, and to me, her biggest hit of last year is Queen Radio.
No, you're
bigger
absolutely
than the
right.
album, bigger than the guest appearances. Queen Radio is the thing that you're just like, oh man, that's the thing that connected and hit and is like, and when you start looking at the industry like that, then it really changes what something that's been music focused for so long now becomes, because there are all these pieces that can be all these pieces that your personality can be more beneficial in than simply just whether the record is dope or not.
Right. Do you feel like in general we've seen that like come out in terms of album quality? Like one of the conversations I have with people a lot is, do we think that there are less classics that are coming out? And I think there's an age factor there. You have to see how things age over time. But as we've been in this new era, do you feel like there's less incentive and that there's also less classic albums that are being put out?
Yeah, but there's certainly less classics, but then there's also, I think that there's the people that I expect classics from aren't, let's say, vastly different, whether it be the Kendricks or the J. Coles, or even Drake to an extent, Kanye, Jay. I would say that there's less classics from new artists. We have not had another Illmatic or DMX's first album, or Tribe Called Quest's first album. It doesn't feel like, and I could be wrong because I'm not 13 right now. I don't know I remember what it was like in 9th grade when my homie was just like, yo, have you heard the new Nas? And I was just like, nah, so there could be something that feels like that. But I also feel like even then, someone in their 20s or 30s could agree that Illmatic was a classic. So it's weird because it doesn't feel like those things exist now in that way. I can see how Triple X's first project could be seen as something as like a seminal work, like, oh, this could be something that could definitely shift. But yeah, I don't know. I haven't necessarily feel like I've seen a ton of classics over the last decade either. There are also things that I consider classics, like 808 and Heartbreaks, that people would throw, tomatoes at me at.
Right. It's funny.
Maybe not the right person.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, 808s is one album that I've definitely grown with over time. But yeah, I look at like Kendrick's work, like those first two albums, well, not the first two albums, but I look at Good Kid, Mad City, probably most specifically as one that stands out. I still look at like Kanye's My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. And like, those are the ones that like stick out for me this decade. Yeah. And I remember years ago, I had posted something. I was like, those are the only two classic albums that it came out. I posted like my friends on Twitter, and it kind of started this like storm about like, oh, what are you talking about? What about this, this, and this? And of course, my friend circle is mostly around the same age that I am. But, you know, I try to kind of put myself in that shoes. Like, okay, what if I was 20 right now? What if I was like 15 right now? Like, what is the best thing? Like, and I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to think of like what are the albums that I really hear like them checking for, and I really don't know if it's that way because I feel like albums can just kind of come and go. Like an album's kind of hot for a minute, but then people kind of just forget about it. But something's kind of last. At least the last thing that sticks out.
Bigger issue.
Yeah, like Kendrick Lamar's "Damn" won a Pulitzer. What was it? A Pulitzer? I always forget what.
Yeah, Pulitzer.
Yeah, won a Pulitzer, and I think that was the last thing. That was 2 years ago that came out. That's like the last thing in my mind that I'm like, okay, that was a classic body of work that was highly regarded in some way.
No, yeah, it's a really weird time because I think that there are a lot of, as with all these things, especially when you even think about topics for articles in terms of case studies, at a certain point, you have to just take a position and kind of pull a single thread. But if you were to unravel really to look at it, or you had an ability to write a book on simply that, you'd realize that it's like all these crazy, weird, different things. Like I was intrigued by the article about Rihanna, right? Mm-hmm. And the conversation about obviously her relationship with LVMH and Kendo and how that has grown in comparison to, let's say, Kanye's relationship with them. And what's always interesting, what I always look at Kanye in, and I'm sure you can even see the thread in a lot of the conversations, even in the Hype Williams article that you talk about, is that Ye doesn't always get it right, but he's been the person who has probably been the most influential for even the people that are bigger than him in taking these leaps forward in what should happen and these ideas. And he doesn't always land on both feet, but what ends up coming after him always seems to benefit more. But if he never did it, then it wouldn't have occurred. Right. You know?
Yeah, it's like the Allen Iverson thing, right? Like someone needs to be this like, cultural beacon that takes all the punches that lets the people that come after him shine. And I guess maybe it's even a little bit differently because I think Allen Iverson still gets a little bit more high regard than what Kanye currently has right now. But it kind of plays into like what you're saying as well, when it's like, okay, 808s, like Drake doesn't blow up if there isn't something like 808s that, bridges the gap and makes that happen. And who knows, maybe we can even tie the connections to be like, okay, Kanye may have, rubbed, shoulders the wrong way with, the Michael Arnault head of LVMH, but does that at least, put something in his brain to be like, okay, I didn't rock with Kanye, but let me get Virgil on the team and elevate him. Okay, now Virgil's here. The ground is softened. Now let's give Rihanna the type of leadership and platform that we haven't given anybody since the 80s, right? So it kind of ties into that thing.
Yeah, and or just even directly, if Kanye never invests $1 million of his own money into Rihanna during the Glow in the Dark tour to scale her show and her idea of self properly, she doesn't get to the high fashion looks that, because if you think about her prior to Shut Up and Drive, Rihanna is not a fashion icon yet, right? But post Glow in the Dark, Disturbia, Dress, all this stuff that basically Kanye essentially footed the bill on because he wanted to see her be dope. That changes her trajectory in that space too. So you could even talk about it even directly in that.
Right. That's true. I forgot all about that. That's a good point.
But yeah, I'm not gonna keep you much longer. I just want to know what's next? What's next for Trapital now that you've moved into this space? Are we gonna get a podcast? Are we gonna get some video content?
Yeah, both of those are in the work and in the plan. So podcast for sure coming soon. And when I think about it, I've done a few things with videos where I've just done quick clips that have summarized the video, summarized the article I've done, or a key take from it. And I've realized that even in the discussion that we're having right now, like there's so much value that can come out of those pieces. And I want to be able to extract more of that. So I see the podcast as another element to do that. So I'm still thinking through the best form of that. And I think there's a few ways that it could play out, but I'm excited for that. So now that I'm getting, things underway with the subscription, I can manage the schedule a bit more and make sure that I have time for that. And then, of course, with that, I'd love to be able to have a video component that made a lot of sense with that, right? Because I just think about like, there's so many things that you see successful with models, but you also want to be relatable to this culture as well. And, I think that's something I've seen, you do well with, the Instagram clips that you'll put out about, the free range pod. And I think like that's legit. And just being able to productize the things that we create into, more digestible things, it is just another way to kind of create that type of funnel I've been talking about. And I think visual tie-ins just make a big deal, and it helps add a connection to us as people that are out here, putting stuff there that I think is almost maybe a little bit easier for you right now as someone that already has a podcast. Like people hear your voice. I think people that know me have heard my voice, but it's just not as consistent. And I think I want the podcast so you can just hear a little bit more about the personality or some of the thoughts and kind of take people a little behind the scenes. And those are the things that excite me that I think that audio and video could do well.
No, definitely. And it's funny though, because, and I was talking about this with It's the Real, is that the one thing that is hard to quantify is, you don't really know when you post those clips or even the clips that end up on YouTube or any of that sort of stuff, if people are simply just watching that and being like, oh, I've watched, I listened to the podcast, or they're actually clicking through. So you just have to do that stuff just to have people know that it exists, basically.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, because I was listening to that episode. I think one of the guys had said something like, oh, I saw you, had so-and-so on the pod. That's cool. Click. Move on with my day.
Exactly.
And it's funny, but because like in our minds, you may be like, okay, did I really go through all that effort just to go take a pic? Like when I could have just gotten the pic and been like, all right, let's go our separate ways. But I do think it makes a difference. And the reason I think it makes the difference is because even if like someone doesn't listen to every podcast episode or every one of your podcast episodes or reads every Trapital article, it's still kind of the healthy awareness of, okay, he is still consistent. He is there. And it just increases the likelihood. Like, let's say that even if you like my content or whoever likes my content, but they themselves may not quite be willing enough to, spend money to, pay for Trapital's membership, they might spread the word to someone that will. Yeah. And that pick is another way of being able to remind them, even if they're just like, okay, cool. You talked to, or you just recorded an episode with, Sheik and Jada. Great. Click, move on. Like it still helps. And I think it can be even tough for me to keep that as a reminder, but I do think it's important.
Yeah, I think there still is, as much as we can analyze and as much as we can, Monday morning quarterback, a lot of these moves that we see, so much of it still is this weird magic that just connects the dots that you think but sometimes you don't really know how it happened. And you're just like, all right, okay, I guess it's working now.
Yeah. Like, I'm sure you might do this too. I do it as well. Every once in a while, I'll talk to someone and I'm like, wait, how did you find out about Trapital? Right? Just to check. And maybe you do the same thing. Like, how did you find out about free range? And most of the time, statistical things like, okay, it was forwarded to me. I heard about it through this. But every once in a while, you're like, came from a friend of a who from a what? And then you're trying to piece together. But it kind of goes back to like what I was saying earlier of like, yeah, you never know who is the one that kind of puts you on to the person that is then willing to support, or could be that connection to take things to another level.
Yeah, and it's funny because even with all this data and information, we are still operating in the same. Humans do not operate any differently in terms of how they find out about most things, which is word of mouth from trusted sources, and then they buy in.
Yeah.
But Thank you, man. Thank you for your time. I won't hold you up any longer. Everybody make sure you check out trapital.co, sign up, tune in.
Thank you. No, appreciate you having me, man. Thank you.
Thank you for your time.